Now, there was a point in time in NBA history where you could legitimately ask a question that today might sound kind of crazy. Was Dwyane Wade the best player in the world? Not the best shooting guard, not the best player in the Eastern Conference, the best player on earth. Because during the 08-09 NBA season, while Kobe was defending an MVP and LeBron James was becoming an unstoppable force, Dwyane Wade quietly put together one of the greatest individual seasons by a guard that we've ever seen in NBA history. He averaged over 30 points, led the entire NBA in scoring. He was one of the league's most disruptive defensive guards, and he did it while carrying a Miami roster that had absolutely no business being anywhere near the top of the Eastern Conference. Yet when we talk about the greatest individual seasons ever, Wade's 09 season rarely comes up. And so today, we're going back to the season where Dwyane Wade wasn't simply competing with Kobe and LeBron. For stretches of that year, he looked like he might actually be better than the both of them. And so with that being said, run that intro. Now, to understand how ridiculous Wade's season was, you first have to understand what happened to Miami. Only 3 years earlier, Wade had become an NBA champion. In the 06 finals against Dallas, he averaged 35 points per game, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists. He won Finals MVP at just 24 years old. Now, it looked like Miami had found a superstar who would keep them competing for championships for the next decade. But everything fell apart incredibly quickly. Shaquille O'Neal declined. The championship roster aged, Wade battled with injuries, and during the 07-08 season, Miami completely collapsed. The Miami Heat finished 15-67, the worst record in the NBA. Think about that. Wade went from winning a championship to playing for a 15-win team in less than 2 years. Miami eventually traded Shaq to Phoenix, and suddenly, Wade wasn't playing alongside another superstar anymore. This was his franchise. Now, take a look at who Miami had surrounding Wade in 08-09. Miami drafted Michael Beasley with the second overall pick. Beasley was talented, but he was 20 years old. Mario Chalmers was a rookie. Udonis Haslem was still there as the reliable veteran. Sean Marion began the season in Miami before eventually being traded for Jermaine O'Neal. You had players like Daquan Cook, Joel Anthony, and James Jones filling important roles. There were useful players, but this wasn't remotely a championship roster. There wasn't another established superstar. There wasn't even another established all-star. What does this mean? This meant Miami's offense essentially had one solution whenever things went wrong. Give the ball to Dwyane Wade. And somehow it worked. Wade played 79 games. He averaged 30 points, 7.5 assists, 5 rebounds, 2.2 steals, 1.3 blocks, and he shot 49% from the field. Listen, read those numbers again. Listen to what I'm telling y'all. 30 points, 7.5 assists, 2 steals, 1.3 blocks per game. Wade finished first in the NBA in scoring. LeBron averaged 28. Kobe averaged 27. Dwyane Wade averaged 30. And this wasn't empty scoring. Miami went from 15 wins the previous season to 43 wins the very next. That's a 28-win improvement. They went from the worst team in basketball to the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. And Wade was the engine behind everything. And so what made Prime Wade so difficult to guard, right? Because it wasn't just his speed. It was a combination of speed, strength, balance, and timing. Wade didn't have Steph Curry's three-point shot. He didn't have Kobe's endless collection of post moves. And he wasn't physically enormous like LeBron. But his first step was devastating. He could attack a defender's hip before they even had time to react. And once Wade got downhill, you had a problem on your hands. Because he wasn't simply trying to avoid contact. Wade would attack the contact. He could split 2 defenders, absorb a hit, and somehow finish while falling sideways. His body control around the rim was ridiculous. And then you had the mid-range game. Wade could come off a screen, stop instantly, pull-up jumper. Wade is coming at you and you want to back up, easy pull-up. If he's coming at you, you want to press him, drive right by you. If the defense sent help, Wade had become an excellent playmaker. That's why the 7.5 assists mattered so much. Miami wasn't asking Wade just to score, they were asking him to create the entire offense. And here's where Wade's season becomes even crazier. Because usually, when a player carries this enormous of an offensive workload, you expect them to conserve energy defensively. Wade did not care. He averaged 2.2 steals, 1.3 blocks. For a little perspective, Wade's shot blocking ability was historically unusual for a guard. He wasn't getting blocks because he was standing underneath the basket like a center. He would chase players down, rotate from the weak side, block jump shooters, strip players attacking the rim, jump passing lanes. He had incredible instincts. And this is one reason I think people undersell prime Wade. We are not talking about a 30-point scorer who you had to hide defensively. First of all, I'm going to take a pause right here to put the Dwyane Wade, James Harden comparisons to bed. Harden couldn't sniff prime Wade's sneakers. Anyway, moving on. We're talking about one of the most disruptive defensive guards in basketball, simultaneously carrying an enormous offensive burden. And right in the middle of the season, right? February and March, something happened. This is where Wade's season went from great to absolutely ridiculous. On February 22nd, against the Orlando Magic, 50 points. A few days later, against Detroit, 31 points, 16 assists. Then against New York, 46 points. Against Cleveland, 41 points. Against Phoenix, 35 points, 16 assists. And then came one of the most defining games of Wade's career. March 9th, 2009, Miami versus Chicago, double overtime. Wade finishes with 48 points, 12 assists, 6 rebounds, 4 steals, 3 blocks. I mean, what is going on? And then with the game tied at the end of double overtime, Wade steals the ball and launches a running three-pointer before LaMelo was doing them. And then bang, game over. That stretch represented everything Wade was that season. The scoring, the playmaking, the defense, clutch performances, I mean everything. But now we get to an uncomfortable conversation, right? Because if we're discussing the best player in basketball in 2009, we have to talk about Kobe Bryant. Kobe was still incredible. He averaged roughly 27 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists. The Lakers won 65 games, and eventually Kobe would lead them to the championship and win Finals MVP. So if you asking me who had the better year considering the playoffs, obviously, no debate, give me Kobe. He won the championship and was the best player on his team. But if you want to ask me who had the better individual regular season, Wade has a serious argument. Wade scored more, he assisted more, he generated more steals, he generated more blocks, and he was carrying a significantly weaker roster. Kobe had Pau Gasol, Lamar Odom, Andrew Bynum. Meta World Peace wasn't there yet, but the Lakers were deep and perfectly constructed around one Kobe. Wade did not have anything even comparable. That's why simply comparing their team records doesn't tell you the entire story, right? And then you have LeBron James, right? Because this is where Wade's argument gets much more difficult. Because 2009 LeBron was something serious by himself. LeBron averaged 28 points, 7.6 rebounds, and 7 assists. Cleveland won 66 games, and LeBron was the MVP. He finished second in Defensive Player of the Year voting. And statistically, he was putting together one of the greatest seasons that we'd ever seen. So, I'm not going to rewrite history and pretend Wade clearly deserved MVP over LeBron. LeBron had an incredible case. But Wade absolutely belonged in the conversation. The MVP voting ultimately had LeBron first, Kobe second, and Wade third. And that's almost unfortunate historically, right? Because people see third in MVP voting and assume Wade was the third best player in the league. But that does not accurately capture how close the conversation felt at the time. There were nights where Wade genuinely looked like the most unstoppable guard in basketball. But there is one major criticism, right? That is team success. Miami won 43 games. Cleveland won 66 in the same conference. Los Angeles won 65. That's an enormous difference. And Miami eventually lost in the first round against Atlanta in 7 games. Wade averaged roughly 29 points that series, but his efficiency dropped significantly compared to the regular season. But similar to what we saw with Detroit and Cade Cunningham this past season, Atlanta was able to load its defense toward him because Miami simply didn't have enough offensive firepower outside of Wade. And that's ultimately the problem with judging Wade's success. His greatest strength was also his biggest disadvantage. He was carrying so much responsibility that eventually the limitations of the roster caught up with him. And so how good was Wade 2009 season historically, right? This is where I think Wade's season deserves more respect. Think about the complete package. You have 30 points a game, 7.5 assists, elite efficiency for that era, excellent defense, a scoring champion, and a 28-win improvement for his team. There aren't many shooting guards in NBA history who have produced that kind of combination. Michael Jordan obviously has seasons above that. Kobe has seasons that belong in the conversation. James Harden has incredible offensive seasons. But when you combine the scoring, the playmaking, the efficiency, the defense, and responsibility, 09 Wade belongs somewhere in that discussion. And I actually think there's another reason we've forgotten that. The Big Three era changed how we remember Wade. 1 year later, everything changed. LeBron came to Miami, Chris Bosh came to Miami, and Wade voluntarily gave up some of his individual dominance to make the team work. By the 11-12 season, it was clearly becoming LeBron's team. Wade remained a superstar, but injuries and age gradually reduced the explosiveness that we'd seen earlier. So, an entire generation remembers Wade primarily as LeBron's sidekick, so to speak. That technically is true, but it's incomplete. Because before LeBron arrived in Miami, Wade had already been a Finals MVP. He had already won a scoring championship. And at his absolute peak, he was competing directly against prime Kobe and a rapidly ascending LeBron James for the title of best basketball player alive. So what if Wade had a better team? And this is a fascinating hypothetical, right? Because imagine 09 Wade with another legitimate all-star, not even a super team, just another reliable 20-point scorer. How far does Miami go, right? Because defense couldn't simply throw everything at Wade anymore. And if Miami wins 50 plus games instead of 43, suddenly the MVP conversation becomes much more interesting. If Wade somehow makes a deep playoff run, we might remember that season completely different. Instead, 09 Wade becomes one of those seasons where an unbelievable individual performance became trapped inside an average team. And so, when people talk about Dwyane Wade today, they'll mention 3 championships. They'll mention the 06 finals. They'll talk about LeBron. They talk about the Big Three. They mention that he's probably the 3rd greatest shooting guard ever. But there's a version of Dwyane Wade that deserves its own conversation. Before the Big Three, before Wade sacrificed his touches, before injuries slowly took away some of that explosiveness, there was 09 Dwyane Wade, a 6'4" guard averaging 30 points and 7 assists while blocking like a forward. You had a player dragging a team that had won 15 games the previous year back into the playoffs, and a player trying to steal the title of best player alive during an era that featured prime Kobe Bryant and prime LeBron James. And so, was Dwyane Wade actually the better player than LeBron that year? Probably not. Was he better than Kobe? Probably not, but you can make that argument. But could Dwyane Wade walk into an NBA arena on any given night in 09 and look like the best player on earth? Absolutely. And that's the version of Dwyane Wade that basketball history does not talk about enough. So here is the question. At his absolute peak, where are you ranking Dwyane Wade? Are you taking 09 Wade over peak Harden? Because I am. I'm sorry. Are you taking 09 Wade over peak Iverson? And if you're building a team for only one season, how many shooting guards in NBA history are you actually taking before 09 Dwyane Wade? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe, because we're going to keep going and keep revisiting the seasons, players, and teams that basketball history has started to forget.